Tov. Today's daf is Memtes, and we start with Mesvei on the top of the Amud. The Brisa is going to be quoted as a question, as a contradiction to Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes on the previous Amud said that holacha, when you take the dam and you bring it towards the Mizbeach, that could be accomplished bismol, even with his left hand. And the Brisa contradicts Rav Sheshes. The Brisa says that Zar, a non-Kohen, and in all these cases, the Brisa is going to paskin that the carbon is possible. The onen, if the Kohen had lost one of his close relatives and it's before the burial, shikar. Rashi learns that shikar means he drank wine. Tosas learns that he drank dvarim hamshakrim, intoxicating beverages. U balmum, if the Kohen is a balmum. In all these cases, if he did the avoda bekabbalah ubeholacha ubizrika, possible. We have to emphasize the word beholacha. We have now 4 avodos, but the first avodah is ksher bizar, and that's shchita. But from after shchita and onwards, from the moment of kabbalah to the halacha, including the halacha and zrika, all this will be possible, be disqualified, what we call avodah mechuleles, in the cases of a zar, an onen, a shikar, or a balmum. V'chein, the Brisa continues, if the avodah was done when the Kohen Yoshev was sitting, and it's possible even to have halacha in a situation where he's sitting, v'chein small, or the Kohen did any of the avodas with his left hand, and the avodas here refer to all the avodas that were enumerated in the reisha of this Brisa, including holacha. Possible, we see clearly, and it's explicit in this Brisa, that holacha with the left hand is psula, and this is against Rav Sheshes Tuvta. And the Gemara says we have to reject Rav Sheshes. The Gemara doesn't understand how could it be that Rav Sheshes did not know about this Brisa. Now, in general, we have many situations where an Amora was unaware of a Brisa. But in this particular case, this Brisa was well known to Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes hu diosma. It was Rav Sheshes himself who actually quoted this Brisa and used this Brisa to object to Rav Chizda. The Amalei Rav Sheshes la Amore to Rav Chizda. Every Amora had a Meturgavan who would project the voice of the Amora who said the Shir. Rav Sheshes would relay a question to Rav Chizda through his Meturgavan. What was the question that he asked Rav Chizda? Boy, mine Rav Chizda. He asked Rav Chizda the following question: Holacha b'zar ma'u. What's the situation if the Holacha Saddam, after the Kabbalah Saddam was done by the Kohen, the Mizrak, which is now full of dam, was brought closer to the Mizbeach by a Zar non-Kohen? Is this kshera or is it not kshera? Do we need a Kohen dafka for halacha sadam or not? Amalei kshera. Rav Chizda responded to the Meturgavan. You could tell Rav Sheshes that in such a case the avodah is kshera. We don't need a Zar for halacha sadam. Umikra Masayeni. And I'm going to prove it from a pasuk in Divrei Yomi. The pasuk is addressing the Hakravas HaPesach at the time that Yoshio was the king of Yehuda, and the pasuk says, "Vayichchatu HaPesach, vayizraku HaKohanim miyadam v'aleviyam mafshitim." The language of the pasuk, "Vayichchatu HaPesach, vayizraku HaKohanim," indicates that the Kohanim only did the zrika. The shchita was done by a zar, and then the pasuk says that vayizraku HaKohanim miyadam. Miyadam means that the Kohanim were makabel the dam from the Zarim. The Zarim did the shchita, and now the Kohanim were makabel the dam of the shchita, and then they did the zrika. What happened in between? It seems from this pasuk quite clearly that as far as the halachas hadam is concerned, there was no Kohen involved. So the Zar did the shchita, the Kohen did the Kabbalah Saddam, and then he would do eventually the zrika. But in between the kabbalah and the zrika, it was the zar who was molich lidam to the mizbeach, and therefore Rav Chizda quoting this pasuk in Divrei Yoma as a support text comes to the conclusion that Allah is ksher b'zar. Most of Rav Sheshes raised the objection to Rav Chizda from the brisa that we just learned. Zar v'onein shikar b'halmum b'kabbalah b'alocha b'zrika pasul. And we see, therefore, that a zar is completely disqualified for halacha. V'chein yoshev v'chein small pasul. Obviously, Rav Sheshes was aware of this brisa. He was the one who brought this brisa as an objection to Rav Chizda. And now, how could it be that Rav Sheshes himself took the position that halacha b'small kshera? I mean, the brisa itself says that halacha b'small psula. And this was the brisa that Rav Sheshes quoted to object to Rav Chizda with regard to a zar in halacha. And Gemara answers, Basa deshama hadar osva. It's only after he found out about the brisa, then he started asking this question. He raised the objection against Rav Chizda. But initially, he was unaware of this brisa, and he took the position, which is almost identical to that of Rav Chizda, that halacha b'zar kshera, halacha b'smol kshera. But now that he knows the brisa, for sure, he would have rescinded his original position. The Gemara asks a kasha of Rav Chizda kraka amar. How can you reject Rav Chizda based on a brisa when Rav Chizda has a proof from a text in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in the Divrei Yomim, that halacha b'zar kshera? And the Gemara answers that no, this pasuk is not talking about a case where the shechita was done by a zar, and the zar himself was molech the dam from the kohanim who were makabel the dam. Ella, but rather the avud maisa itztaba. Itztaba is a chair or a couch that's made of stone, and it's used here to describe a person who's sitting in a stationary position. It's a maisa itztaba. The kohanim were makabel the dam. They left the dam in the mizrach in the hands of a zar. The zar was sitting there on the itztaba. He didn't move 1 inch. And he wasn't makarev the dam to the mizbeach. He didn't bring it closer, so there was no halacha al yidei zar. The kohanim took it from the hands of the zar, and they were molech it to the mizbeach. Boy Rav Papa. The Gemara now goes back to discuss the halach of chafina when the Kohen Gadol has to scoop up the Torah on Yom Kippur. Chafan chavero. What happens if a Kohen, a regular Kohen, does the chafina and v'nasan l'tol chafnav, and then he places the ktores into the palms, the extended palms of the Kohen Gadol. Mal, how do we learn the pasuk? The pasuk in Vayikra Tezayin says v'lokach malo chafnav ktores. Does it mean malo chafnav be'inon? It has to be malo chafnav. It doesn't mean that it has to be malo chafnav of the person who's going to bring it into the Kodesh Kodashim, because the ratio of the pasuk says v'lokach malo chafnav, and then the Sefer says v'hevi mibeis laparocha. So it could be possible there are 2 different individuals here. The Malol Chafnav at the beginning of the pasuk is a Kohen, and the Hevi Mibeis LaParoches is referring to the Kohen Gadol Vayika. So now this halach, this requirement was fulfilled because the Kohen Gadol is going to bring the Ktoretz Malol Chafnav. He didn't have to do the Velachach. Velachach could have been referring to a different Kohen. So when it says Velachach, it means he takes the Malol Chafnav that was poured to him by his friend, but it was his friend, a regular Kohen, who did the original Malol Chafnav. Dilmach would say, no, v'lakach v'hevi be'inon. We should read the word v'lakach together with v'hevi. And it's all one indivisible activity, which means that we need the v'lakach Malol Chafnav and then v'hevi. The same person who is indicated at the beginning of the pasuk v'lakach, he himself scooped up the Ketores into his hands. He's the one who's going to take it into the Kodesh Kodashim. But here in this case, you weren't makayim the principle of lakach v'hevi, because it wasn't this Kohen Gadol who did the Lakicha, meaning who took it into his Malach Chacham, but rather was Chavero. And the Gemara answers Teku. The Gemara says that this remains an outstanding question. We have no final answer. Boy, Rav Yeshua ben Levi, here's another suffix, which is similar to the previous one. Chafan umes maushi kones acher b'chafinosa. The first Kohen Gadol did the chafina. He dug his hands and scooped up the kars in his hands. Subsequently, before he got a chance to go into the Kodesh Kodashim, he died. And the Rishonim talk about other possibilities. He didn't die. He became tamei. He became pasul. Can a second Kohen Gadol, who's going to replace the first Kohen Gadol, go into the Kodesh Kodashim without doing a chafina, based on the first Kohen Gadol's chafina? And once the first Kohen Gadol had done the chafina, there's no need for a second chafina. As we look at the chefts of the Ketores, there was a chafina that was done in this Ketores. Now the second replacement Kohen Gadol could take that Ketores, which has a shem chafina, and bring it into the Kodesh Kodashim. Amar Rab Chanina, bo ure'ei shelas harishonim. He says that our generation, the younger generation, was merited with our wisdom and our dedication to studying Torah. We were able to come up with the she'ela, with a question that was already asked by the Rishonim, which means that Reb Chanina is telling us that he himself had this question. And as it turns out, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi from the earlier generation had formulated this question originally, and Rabbi Chanina came up with this question on his own. So in a sense, he's saying that even the younger generation of Talmidim can come up with questions of the earlier generation. So the Gemara says, Lamema, does that mean to tell us that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Koshish, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was older than Rabbi Chanina, and therefore Rabbi Chanina was, in a sense, very happy, and he was glorified by the fact that he came up with the same question as one of the Rishonim, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi belonged to an early generation. The Gemara now is going to prove that, on the contrary, it was Rabbi Chanina who was kosher. He was older than Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Omar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, li hiter Rabbi Chanina. Imagine he calls him Rabbi Chanina, and he said he gave him a heter, he gave him a ruling permitting him lishtos shachalayim b'Shabbos. Shachalayim is kind of a cress. It's a kind of a vegetation that is very healthy, and it's therapeutic. And you might have thought that it's also on Shabbos to take such a thing because it's a refuah b'Shabbos. We don't take refuah b'Shabbos, and yet Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, when I asked my Rebbe, Rabbi Chanina, he allowed me, permitted me to drink. Now, from this point, for a few lines in the Gemara, we're going to have a little bit of a digression about this whole give and take, and the suffix about, can you take this shachalayim on Shabbos, can you not? But again, the main point here is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi calls Rabbi Chanina his Rebbe, which is the exact opposite of what we said, that Rabbi Chanina said that I was machamin to the Shelas HaRishonim, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi came up with this question before him. The question of, if the first Kohen Gadol did the chafina, can the second Kohen Gadol rely on that chafina and just take the Torah into the Kodesh Kodashim? So the Gemara asks, Lishtos, did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi ask Rabbi Chanina whether you're allowed to drink shachalayim on Shabbos? Pshita, certainly there was no question about it. This time we have a Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos on Daf Kuf Tes Amud Beis, that kol ha'ochlim, anything that people would normally eat, even if they're healthy, is ochel odom l'refuah. You're allowed to eat that even for the purpose of refuah. There's no itzer refuah, which is exera to shkika samamonim, in a case of something that could be considered machal bria. And so too, v'chol ha'mashkin shosa, any beverages that would be normally drunk, even if you're healthy, can be taken for the sake of refuah. There's no exera of refuah. And this is a Mishnah that's explicit. Shachalayim, therefore, if he drinks it, It's derech briam l'shtoso. There are even healthy people who drink this concoction. Ella, but rather lichchok v'lichtos shachalayim b'Shabbos. What he was asking, what Rabbi Shimon Levi was asking Rabbi Chanina, and he needed a heter, was whether or not he could take this natural substance called shachalayim and crush it, which means that he would violate a malacha doraisa of maleches tochen. Trikas samimonim is a tolda of tochen. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? He was asking him whether he's allowed to do a malacha doraisa, violate the Shabbos. Hechidami. Idika sakanta is mishvasharit. I don't need to ask such a question. In fact, you're not even allowed to ask such a question. There's a sakana, someone's life in danger. He should have gone ahead and done it on his own. That's pshita. The idoleka sakanta. But if there's no sakana, meisar asur, certainly this should be asur. How could anyone, how could Rabbi Chanina permit violating a malacha doraisa for the sake of refuah? Liolam dika sakanta. V'hacha kami boile. This was what Rabbi Yeshua Levi was confused about. Mi masya, the nechol alai shabsa. We could be machal the Shabbos because masya, meaning it has indeed therapeutic value. He's asking Rabbi Chanina for his medical expertise. He wasn't asking a halachic shaila. Surely there was a pikuach nefesh situation here. Somebody's life was threatened. But the question is, can we violate X if it's going to save his life? I mean, if it doesn't work, if it's not effective, then there's no point to violating the Shabbos, no heter. Oh, lo masya, it's not effective. He was asking a medical question. V'lo nechel alayim Shabbos, so we cannot be mechal Shabbos. And Rab Chanina said, no, it has therapeutic value, and he has a pikuach nefesh, you're allowed to violate the Shabbos and the meleches tchina. Umayshna Rabbi Chanina, why, of all people, to ask a medical issue and tap into some medical physician's expertise, Rabbi Yeshua Levi had to call upon Rabbi Chanina? And the Gemara answers yes. Why? Mishum de Rabbi Chanina baki b'refuah. So he's the expert on therapeutic medicine. Daha Rabbi Chanina, I'll prove it to you. May olam Amar Rabbi Chanina, he made a declaration. May olam lo chalani adam al makas pir de levana, a white mule. If you were attacked by a white mule, this has to do with rabid dogs, and in this case mules, v'chaya. No one who ever asked me the question about a person, a victim of an attack of a white mule and survived it, v'chaya. No one survived it. So you see clearly that Rabbi Chanina was an expert in medicine. He was the final, the consultation went to him. So the Gemara now again goes off on a tangent. Is it really true that a person who gets attacked by a white mule will certainly die? We see people who actually were attacked and viciously by a white mule, and yet they survived it. Emo, we should interpret Rabbi Chanina's statement that no one ever asked me about a certain kind of a white mule, v'chayas. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Is Ema v'chayas? He says we should reinterpret Rabbi Chanina and says there was no one who got attacked and eventually had a pure 100% therapy. In other words, he went back to being as healthy as he was before. And yet the Gemara says we saw that people who got attacked by a white mule and yet they were able to regain their health. Gemara answers, no. We have to understand what kind of mule it was, not your run-of-the-mill white mule. But rather, the sumka. Sumka is red. So we're talking about a red mule. The chivaran reisha kare kamina, but the feet or the top part of the feet of these red mules were white. So it's a red mule with white feet. And that was the mule that was so dangerous, about which Rabbi Hanina said in all his expertise, that no one was able to completely recover from such an injury. I'm getting back to our main question here about who is older, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi or Rabbi Hanina. Shmamino the Rabbi Hanina koshish. From the fact that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asked his Rebbe, Rabbi Hanina, this medical question, you see clearly that by calling him Rebbe, Rabbi Hanina must have been older than Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So the Gemara says, you know what? Rabbi Hanina did not say that the question of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was Bo Ure'eh She'elas Rishonim, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was the Rishonim, and we came up with the question of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ella, just the opposite, Hachi Kama. This is what Rabbi Hanina was telling his students regarding the question of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, She'elasan. Here we have to add Shalachronim. You know, there's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who's the younger generation, She'elat Shal Rishonim. It's just like the question that I asked, meaning, although Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi came to the scene and asked the question, you should know, I, from the earlier generation, had already come up with the same question. So how great is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that he came up with the question of the earlier generation? Now the Gemara is getting back to the question of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, which Rabbi Hanina said, I myself had this question. In a case where the first Kohen Gadol did the chafina and then he died, can a second Kohen Gadol continue from where he left off and take the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol and bring it into the Kodesh Kodashim? So the Gemara asks, Umi Omer Rab Chanina Hachi, is it possible that Rab Chanina had this suffix in the case where Kohen Gadol Rishon did the chafina and then he died, and now the second Kohen Gadol takes over and he can bring in that chafina into Kodesh Kodashim or not? Va'amar Rab Chanina was interpreting a pasuk in Vayikra Tezayin. In Parshas Achrimos it says, "V'zos yavo Aaron el hakodesh, v'par ben bakar lechatos." This is actually the very next pasuk from the pasuk that we had quoted earlier about v'lokach v'hevi. In any event, it says that Aaron will only enter into the Kodesh Kodashim bipar, meaning first he's got to bring his par lechatos. And what do we derive from this? Rab Chanina derives from this that bipar v'lo b'domo shel par. It means that the Kohen Gadol has to do the shechita. It's not enough that somebody, even a previous Kohen Gadol, did the shechita, and there was a kabbalas hadam, and now the replacement Kohen Gadol is going to bring that dam and do the hazos with the dam. No. V'lo b'domo shel par. The pasuk says bipar. Bipar means that the Kohen Gadol, in order to go into the Kodesh Kodashim and continue with the avoda and do the Torahs, etc., he's got to go into the Kodesh Kodashim only after par, not domo shel par, but par. He's got to do the shechita. V'yomer Rab Chanina, and furthermore, Rab Chanina said, Torahs shechafana kodem shechita sapar lo asav lo klum. The Seder HaParsha, the Seder Avoda, is very clear. And the Torah first says, Ve'ekriv Aaron es parach hatosa shalo, and then afterwards, V'lakach malo chaftav Torahs, it said Shevehevi. So it's critical that first the Kohen Gadol does the Shechita Sapar, and then he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim and he's maktir the Torahs. But if he was maktir the Torahs before the Shechita Sapar, lo asa v'lo klum, it's totally invalid. Now, if the Kohen Gadol, number one, right, Rishon, he did the chafina and then he died, he must have done the chafina after he shechted the par, because otherwise there's no chafina before the shechita of the par. So now the Kohen Gadol Hasheni cannot possibly enter in to the Kodesh Kodashim by taking the dam of the par of the Rishon. Why? Because we said b'par v'lo b'damot shel par. Memela, it's impossible that the second Kohen Gadol would do the chafina, or I shouldn't say do the chafina, but would rely on the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol and take that in, because the second Kohen Gadol can't do the avoda of the Ketores Lifnai V'Lifnim until he does the Shchitas HaPar. So that it's obvious now that this whole issue about whether or not the second Kohen Gadol after the death of the first Kohen Gadol could take the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol and go into the Kodesh Kadoshim, that's an impossible question. Because the only way you could go into the Kodesh Kadoshim to do the Aktoris Aktoris is after you do the Shchitas HaPar. And it's not enough that he pick up the dam from the Shchita of the previous Kohen Gadol. He's got to do the Shchita itself. So then he's going to do the Shchita, he's going to have to do the chafina. Any chafina that took place before the shechita, Rabbi Chanina says is completely invalid. So Gemara says hachikam. This is what Rabbi Chanina had in mind. Mi dekami boilecha, from the fact that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi had a suffix with regard to a case where one Kohen Gadol did the chafina and then he died. Can the second Kohen Gadol pick up that chafina, go into the Kodesh Kodashim? Michalal de kasavar. I could derive from this the conclusion that Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion that that's not, that we don't read the pasuk b'par the way we read it, but rather we read it b'par afilu b'damo shel par. That it's enough that the Kohen Gadol takes the dam of the par, meaning the shechita was done by the first Kohen Gadol, and there was a kabbalah sadam. The dam is now in the mizrach. The Kohen Gadol dies. The second Kohen Gadol that replaces the first can take the dam, and he could do the hazah of the dam, and it's as if he did the shechita and the hazah sadam. In other words, everything is considered his. Why? Because the Torah says bepar afilu b'damo shel par. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's own shita, that the second string replacement Kohen Gadol after the shechita, the first Kohen Gadol of the par, can take the dam, and that's enough to be considered the avoda of the dam, and therefore, when the Torah says "V'hikriv Aaron es parachatos asher lo," it's referring to the dam achatos. Is now sheiloso kisheelas harishonim, meaning according to Reb Chanina himself, he's of the opinion b'par v'lo b'damo shel par. So this whole question is an impossible question about relying on the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, l'shitaso, that he was of the opinion that it's even b'damo shel par. Now the question becomes very relevant. The first Kohen Gadol did the shechita, the dam is in the mizrach. Then he went ahead, this first Kohen Gadol, he did the chafina, then he died. And now the second string Kohen Gadol replacement wants to take that chafina into the Kodesh Kadoshim. And he can do the avodah, the par, with the dam itself. And that's a shela kishela sarichona, meaning, according to those who disagree with me, says Reb Chanina, and hold that par means afil b'damo shel par, now we have an excellent question. The damo shel par is sufficient to validate the avodah, the par, as far as the second string Kohen Gadol is concerned. And now, can he rely on the chafina of the Kohen Gadol Rishon, or does he have to do his own personal chafina? My Havi Allah, Gemara wants to know what's the final hachra, the final decision in regarding the question of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Can the second Kohen Gadol rely on the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol? Amar Papa, this din depends upon a different question, a different suffix, which the Gemara is going to clarify in a minute. And that is whether a Kohen Gadol does one chafina, which means outside the Kodesh Kadoshim, and that's it, or does he do a second chafina inside the Kodesh Kadoshim? In other words, inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, he has the Ketores inside a kaf, and now he has to do the chafina, a second chafina. The first chafina outside was to take the Ketores out of the machta with a chafina, and then he's going to carry that chafina with a kaf in his left hand and the yecholim in the machta in his right hand. And now he goes into the Kodesh Kadoshim. He's holding on to a kaf which is filled with molei chafnav, and he's got to do a second chafina. That's called choser v'chofen. Inside the Kodesh Kodashim, he has to implement a second chafina. Avero nichnas bechafina. So, and is it possible now? You're asking whether or not after the first Kohen Gadol did the chafina, can the second Kohen Gadol now take that chafina and bring it into the Kodesh Kodashim? The answer is Doma Kaimi chafina. Now he has to do a second chafina in the Kodesh Kodashim, and then he's going to fulfill the mitzvah of chafina. So it should be totally irrelevant if the first Kohen Gadol did the chafina, because the second Kohen Gadol is going to do his chafina when he gets into the Kodesh Kodashim. But if on the other there's only one chafina outside the Kodesh Kodashim, there's never a second chafina inside the Kodesh Kodashim, ti boilach. Now you could have a suffix. Can the second Kohen Gadol rely on the chafina of the first Kohen Gadol? So there are two chafinos. And I'm sorry, now we're holding that there's only one chafina. And since that one chafina was implemented by the first Kohen Gadol, the second Kohen Gadol might not be able to take that into the and be makter because he didn't do a chafina. I come up with the exact opposite logic. There's no doubt about it that the second Kohen Gadol cannot rely on the first chafina of the first Kohen Gadol. If you hold that choser v'chofen, we need a second chafina. Why? It's impossible that the exact volume, the exact measurement of the chafina is equal to both Kohanim Gedolim. So the second Kohen Gadol's chafina will be the larger or smaller, and the Torah requires exactly, precisely that midah of the chafina. But if we only need one chafina outside the Kodesh Kodashim, tiboilach, then we could have a valid suffix in a case where the first Kohen Gadol did the chafina and then he died. Can the second Kohen Gadol take the first chafina, and that would be sufficient? And then we don't have to make sure that the midah of the Kohen Gadol Hasheni is equal to that of the Rishon, which is impossible because there's no need for a second chafina. The boilu, now the Gemara goes into the suffix itself. Chofen, the choser v'chofen olo. Is there a second chafina required? Tashma. And now we're going to determine the answer to this suffix. The Mishnah adds another phrase over here. My love, shouldn't we interpret as meaning meaning that there's a second chafina that's required, and kachi midasa, the second chafina, requires the exact same midah. This is a very difficult goal to achieve as the first chafina. So we see clearly from the Mishnah that choser v'chofen bifnim needs a second chafina. Lo, the Gemara rejects it. Dilma, perhaps what the Mishnah means is shemrotza lasos midah. Also, that if he wants to create a kli that would have exactly the receptacle would have the ability to hold the volume of his mole ofnav, then that's fine. He doesn't have to actually dig his hands into the ketores. He could just simply dig the kli into the ketores because he made sure that the kli would have exactly the volume of his mole chafna. Inami, another way of interpreting the Mishnah, that in the second chafina, he's got to do the exact same chafina as the first one. Just 1 second. Inami, let's read it again. You don't need a second chafina, but shalo yichasef shalo yoser. It's really referring to the first chafina because there's only one chafina, and when it says kemidasa kach midasa b'fnim, it means that the ketores should be exactly molei chafnav, not more, not less.